China is redefining authoritarianism. Well, the CCP knows that in order to rule the world, it needs to deceive it. That means changing the meaning of words. Welcome to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. So, China is run by a brutal authoritarian regime that uses rape as a form of torture. This isn't a mystery. Joe Biden keeps calling Xi Jinping a dictator. Last week, the UK Prime Minister grouped China with Russia, Iran, and North Korea as an axis of authoritarian states. So what is China doing about all this? Why, they're redefining authoritarianism. That happened on Baidu, China's equivalent of Google. They now define authoritarianism as a transitional political system between totalitarian politics and modern democratic politics, with both democratic elements and coercion of centralized power. Kind of like how Marx said socialism was a transitional system between capitalist democracy and true communism, where elected socialists would overthrow the government and install communism. So, yes, it's true. You can vote your way into communism, but you can't vote your way out. Baidu also says that authoritarianism provides a stable environment for economic development and lays the foundation for transformation to democracy. So in other words, we need authoritarianism in order for the economy and democracy to thrive. It's just like Helldivers 2. This is an absolutely classic Marxist tactic. If your enemy uses words against you, simply redefine them. With that in mind, how is Baidu defining totalitarianism and democracy? Well, it describes totalitarianism as when the state has absolute authority over society and seeks to control public and private life in every possible way. It cites Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union as examples. Interestingly, it doesn't include China under Mao Zedong. I guess he was, what, a democratic authoritarian Capricorn? Democracy is defined as a process of listening to everyone's views with the aim of finding the greatest common denominator and acting in accordance with the views of the majority. As for the minority, they must obey the majority to maximize the effectiveness of the system. Hear that, Uyghurs? You must obey even if you're facing genocide. Why are you crying? Because you hate democracy, you dictators? Now keep in mind that these definitions are set by Baidu, not the CCP directly, by Chinese leader Xi Jinping, or by Chinese state-run media. So technically the CCP isn't making Baidu's new definition of authoritarianism official. But given how the CCP has Orwellian control over the Chinese internet and corporations, chances are Baidu wouldn't have made this change unless they thought this was what the CCP would want. And given how Baidu's redefinition of authoritarianism hasn't been censored, the CCP is likely cool with it. So why does China put so much effort into redefining words? Well, the CCP knows that in order to rule the world, it needs to deceive it. That means changing the meaning of words. Freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. Smart people use TikTok. That last example wasn't a direct quote, but I'm pretty sure it's what George Orwell implied. China is by no means a democracy, and yet it claims to have the best democracy, a whole process people's democracy. And that word soup is not what you or I would define as democracy, and certainly not the kind of republic the US has. Democracy in China means elections are run by CCP committees that pick people who are allowed to run for national, provincial, and local people's congresses. It's this kind of system that allows Xi Jinping to become president for life with a vote of 2,952 to 0. I guess Baidu's definition really does make sense. China really has blended together totalitarianism and democracy. This is something Mao did way back in his day. China's constitution says it's a democratic dictatorship of the people. How do you combine democracy and dictatorship? Well, as Mao said, democracy for the people and dictatorship over the reactionaries. In other words, not everyone in China is part of the people. The people are only the ones who agree with the party. Or as Baidu now says, the minority must obey the majority. Which is not what happens in the United States Republican style of government. The Communist Party also changed the definition of human rights. Did you know China is a role model for human rights? Despite what those democracy-hating Uyghurs would lead you to believe. Now you might be wondering how China could ever claim it has great human rights. Freedom House ranked China 9 out of 100 last year, with -2 out of 40 for political rights. Let me repeat, not 0 out of 40, -2. They have negative rights, which, as we all know, is a hallmark of a thriving democracy. Well, human rights aren't what you or I think of as human rights, things like freedom of religion, freedom of speech. Human rights is lifting people out of poverty. How did they lift people out of poverty? Why, they changed the definition of poverty. The World Bank defines it as making less than $1.90 a day. China changed it to less than $1 a day. If you use the standard definition of poverty, it's possible that the number of people living in poverty in China could be as high as 1 billion, which I can only assume means China will soon change the definition of 1 billion. It's only about a couple dozen. We say China is committing genocide of Uyghurs and putting them in concentration camps. They call it vocational education and training centers. There's an old joke. How do you know when a communist is lying? When they're speaking. But don't think these are just goofy changes. There's a reason the Communist Party is making these changes. For decades, the CCP has tricked the West into investing in China, giving them access to international institutions like the World Trade Organization by promising reform, by changing language like this. It's that whole thing in Baidu's definition of authoritarianism, of transitioning to democracy. How long is that transition? What does that transition look like? Does it even matter when you change the definition of democracy to mean the same thing as dictatorship? So whenever you hear Western leaders talk about how we need to work with China, just remember, China is a country that uses rape as a form of torture. The CCP hates that I constantly remind people of that fact. That's why Chinese state-run media has called China Uncensored disgraceful anti-China garbage. But the CCP hasn't seen anything yet. I'll tease a bit that I've got a big project coming up that I think you're really going to like. That's why I need your support on the crowdfunding website patreon.com/China Uncensored. All it takes is $1 or more an episode. I make about 16 episodes a month, but if that's too much for you, you can set a monthly limit. So you can ensure I keep uncensoring China for even $1 a month. And as a thank you to everyone who gives on Patreon, I'll answer one of your questions at the end of these episodes. Today's question comes from Inside. You know, I thought the CEOs of large corporations were very smart, well-informed, and had access to all kinds of information that the average investor does not. So how can they be so stupid as to believe all the lies coming out from the CCP's bullish fake financial reports? Yeah, that's a great question, Inside. I guess I could have included that. China also changed the definition of GDP. The thing is, by changing definitions like I talked about in this episode, the CCP has tricked a lot of people. A lot of the investment in China is pension funds. Those are long-term investments. And the idea is that over time, as China reforms and transitions to democracy, the economy will do better and better. So sure, right now there's a smattering of genocide, but in 30 years, things will be much better. So these ESG, environmental, social, and governance investments will pay off big. There's another side to it. For many of the CEOs, their salaries and bonuses are based on short-term growth. They get their company into China, business booms, they get a fat paycheck, and get out before China steals the company's IP and runs it out of business. For a long time, there was a very real opportunity to make a lot of money quickly in the China market. But the price of that was empowering an authoritarian regime, and I'm using the real definition of authoritarian, that is threatening the entire world and whose economy is currently in free fall. Thanks for your question and your support, Inside. Thank you for watching. If you didn't know, I also talk about news and politics through the lens of gaming on my new show, Deep Thoughts While Gaming. Click on this video about the latest controversy over the beauty standards in the very popular hit new game, Stellar Blade. Let me know what you think. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. See you next time.